Strength. Well, there's a variety of different kinds of strength. And we're going to look at two different examples today. But oftentimes when we talk about strength, we oftentimes think of physical strength. And so that's where the Hulk comes in. The Hulk, his real name is Bruce Banner, and he's exposed to some gamma rays. If you don't know much about the Hulk, he's exposed to some gamma rays. And he then has to spend the rest of his life trying to figure out a balance between the Hulk and Bruce Banner, the scientist. And he was created back in 1962 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And one of the reasons why he was created is that another one of the superheroes, The Thing, part of the Fantastic Four, became so popular and was actually most people's favorite superhero at that time. And so what Stan Lee and Jack Kirby decided to do was to create something like The Thing. And so that's how the Hulk came about. Now, there's been many different adaptations of the Hulk, played by a variety of different people. The Hulk was on TV, played by Lou Ferrigno, and people seem to really enjoy that. I only know that because of watching King of Queens. But the Hulk is this character that has this superhuman strength. He's also green, as you probably saw from when I held up the little person for the children's chat. But the problem is that Bruce Banner, he struggles to control the transformation, and that the Hulk can be highly unpredictable. And in the midst of the Hulk being unpredictable, the Hulk has this habit of being highly destructive as well. Now, the inspiration for the Hulk, while it was a response to The Thing, the rumor mill, at least, is that Kirby and Lee saw a mom lifting up a car to save her child, and so the idea was that ordinary people could do extraordinary things given the right situations. I want to take time now that we've kind of looked at the Hulk as kind of being this example of strength. I want to take time now and I want to reflect on our passages. Now we have two passages, the first from Judges 4 and the second from later in that same book. But we have two different forms of strength that we're going to talk about today. And the first is the strength that we are really called to be as Christians, and it's the strength of wisdom, this strength of being self-aware that we're called to be. And we have that example in Deborah. Now, as we kind of look at these verses kind of individually, but together, verses 4 and 5, Deborah, her name actually means honeybee. And she was a prophet, and she was a judge, and she's the first functioned as this judge in deciding disputes that were in court. So the term that we think of judge very much was prevalent back in Bible times, and that's what she is. She's located about 8 or 10 miles north of Jerusalem, and really, Deborah is the only figure that's portrayed in the book of Judges that actually functions in this position and capacity as an actual judge. And she's also the only woman in this distinguished company of prophets that are in Judges. Most of the time in Judges, ironically, is you would think that they were all judges. Really, judges were they're the prophets that are speaking the judgment that will come about to Israel and the surrounding areas. Again, really, Deborah's the only one that really functions within that role of an actual judge. But in verses 6 and 7, in our next two verses, Deborah, she's speaking as the Lord's prophet. And she commends Barak to muster up 10,000 men and to lead them to Mount Tabor. Now, Mount Tabor was a place of relative safety from the Canaanite chariots and a launching ground from which the enemy would attack below. And so it was kind of this safe haven. And so Deborah tells Barak, you need to get 10,000 people to this place of safety. But in verses 8 and 9, we see that Barak has hesitations. And regardless of the motivation that Barak has, his reply to Deborah is conditional. And the condition is, if you don't go with me, I'm not going to go. And it was really not a very fitting response to a command of God. Now, perhaps maybe Barak simply wanted to be assured of divine presence in the midst of battle, and that's why he wanted Deborah to be there. But he wanted to just make sure that everything was okay. That may be one reason, or the other reason maybe he was just scared. And since Deborah was the prophet of God, that he just wanted to make sure that she was there, and so he didn't have the courage to be able to do it. But regardless of the reason why he said no, it is kind of ironic that in the heroes of the faith, in the Hall of Fame that's in Hebrews in the New Testament, Barak's actually listed. Maybe it's because he did follow through. Maybe it's because he was self-aware of where he was. But Deborah agrees to go. And Deborah agrees to go, but she says that Barak's conditional response to this divine command, well, it was the basis for withholding honor from Barak. That the honor of this battle and winning this battle would not go to Barak. Now, Barak no doubt thought that she meant herself, but the statement, it's prophetic, anticipating the role of Jael. Friends, one thing that we can really understand from the story of Deborah is not only that there's strength and wisdom, but that the divine call is never alone. That the divine call, well, it's accompanied by divine provision. God doesn't call us to do something and then just say, best of luck. God provides along the way. Now we get to basically the Hulk of the Bible, which is Samson. And this passage is later on in that same book of Judges. Now, again, Samson was never a judge in terms of the sense that we might think, or like Deborah was. Samson, ironically, if you read the whole story of Samson, he does a lot of killing of Philistines, doesn't really spread a whole lot of wisdom, but he's still considered a judge. Now, ultimately, he does render a verdict at the end, which we are here at the end, in terms of he has the final say of what happens to the Philistines. But as we start here in verse 23, it was common practice in the other nations to do what they did with Samson, to bring their prisoner out, to mock him or her, to make fun of them, to really kind of completely humiliate them in honor of their God. They ultimately, the reason why they're gathering is they want to give credit to Dagon, which is the god that they are worshiping. And so they bring Samson out and they begin to poke fun and make fun of Samson. But in the midst of doing all of this, Samson, he's been humbled. And he's now ready for service to God. Now, we still kind of hear about this nowadays. It is not as dramatic as what unfolds here, but oftentimes when you're watching a sporting event, you'll hear individuals give thanks to God, that God was there with them and different things like that. When they win, you don't so much hear it when they lose, but that's one prime example of something similar that we can experience today and that we have experienced in hearing other people. But they brought Samson out and they're in the process of humiliating him. And in the next verse, in verse 24, we hear about the people. So what this really means and why this is significant is it's not just the leadership of the Philistines. No, this is everybody. Everybody is gathered in celebration of Dagon, that they're there to see what's happened to Samson. And it's pretty clear that the leadership isn't alone in this passage, that there's a number of people. And it seems pretty clear that Samson's been put on public display for everyone who's been gathered. The entertainment, which is in verse 25, this word entertainment provided by Samson, it probably wasn't a song and a dance and different things. It probably wasn't connected to his wit or his strength that he showed earlier on, but rather the fact that they had blinded the mighty Samson and that they had restrained the mighty Samson. He probably put obstacles in his way or tripping him. That's probably a couple of things that happened just to show some of the possibilities of cruelty that they could have inflicted on Samson. After all, he is blind now. He's in an unfamiliar place. But in order for us to really understand what happens here at the end of the passage, we need to understand what the place looks like, which we get from verse 27. It's really kind of an amphitheater with pillars all around and everyone's kind of gathered. But it's not until verse 28 where we really see Samson, the Samson that worships God, that worships Yahweh, really come to the fold. In verse 28, it's where Samson cries out to God. It's the first mention of Samson spending any time with God and praying to God since he gave the fountain a name of Enhekerah earlier in the passage, earlier in Samson's story. Perhaps we may see in this bit that his affliction and his shame had not been there without the effect in bringing him back to God. And the fact that now he's humbled and he's sorry for all that has happened. We see that his language, it's very earnest, it's very honest. The cry that he has out, the language that's used, it's this personal cry in the midst of a personal crisis. It really sets the stage for how Israel should be reacting. They should be crying out in the midst of their crisis. After he offers up this prayer, what winds up happening is he literally brings down the house. That's even what the literal translation says. He brings down the house. Now, really what happens is there's a twisting motion of the pillars. That's what the literal idea is in this structure, to make it come down. And he's twisting these pillars and everything comes down. And the Philistines that are gathered there are no more. Samson is no more. But even the individual who was the Hulk of the Bible had to be humbled, had to have an attitude of service to God. Friends, there's two different types of strength. There's the strength of wisdom, the strength of self-awareness that we find in Deborah and even in Barak, who is humble enough to admit that he's scared. But then there's Samson. Samson, who's super strong, but really his strength doesn't come until that prayer at the end, which has two parts. Yahweh, remember me. And the second is that personal response to a personal crisis. You don't have to be the Hulk in life. We're not called to be the Hulk. What we're called to be is people of strength, people that walk alongside each other, people that aren't worried about credit. I want to close with how shipbuilders built sailboats way back in the day, and particularly the masts. Now, the mast has to be a very strong point because it's going to hold up the sails, right? And the sails, the wind can really pick up and take off. And so the stories are told the way that the wood for the mast would be made is the builders would go into the forest. They would find a tree. They would chop down all of the surrounding trees, which I guess they would use for other parts of the boat, and they would leave that tree standing individually by itself to experience the harsh weathers, the sun. The idea was to get this part that was going to be the mast that controlled everything, to get it weathered. because that's really where the strength was found. Friends, sometimes that's true in life. Sometimes strength, it's not about how much you can lift. It's not about always carrying other people. Sometimes the storms in life that we experience, they do indeed make us stronger. It's like that wood that's designed specifically for the mast. Friends, you don't have to be the Hulk. You don't have to try to carry it all. Learn from Deborah. Use wisdom. But make sure in the midst of that process of using wisdom and using that to your strength, make sure you don't forget the strength of Barak and Samson to be humble and following through with what God wants you to do. After all, it's not about who receives the credit. Ultimately, the credit is God's. But it's about journeying along the way, journeying with others, being someone that others can rely on. May we rise to that challenge this week. Amen.